our guest today is, she's connected. Karin Smith. She's a South African expatriate, married to an American, and now makes her home in the panhandle of Texas or somewhere thereabouts. Her family fled the civil war in Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe, after both of her parents had been severely injured as a result of the random violence that was targeted at people of European descent. Now, the family moved to Southwest Africa, which is now called Namibia, and then left for South Africa when fighting in Angola spilled over into Southwest Africa. She has been educated in all three of these countries, but graduated from high school in South Africa and went on to study nursing. She has worked in the casino and retail industries, holding upper management positions and responsible for dealings with various labor unions. Her 5 siblings have all suffered attacks, and her parents, who are farmers in South Africa, have been attacked twice over the last 3 years by gangs armed with AK-47s. Her father died last September as a direct result of one of these. She has been an activist calling for world attention to the white genocide in South Africa for the past 10 years, and her website can be found at whitegenocidesa.com. That's whitegenocidesa.com. She recently appeared here on Patricia's show, Sacred Barbecue, with Patricia Aiken, as well as Red Ice Radio, Renegade Broadcasting, and others. And from what I've been told, she has a riveting tale to tell. And here she is. Karin, welcome to Inside the Eye Live.
Thank you, Dennis. It's an absolute honor to be here.
It's great to have you here. You know, I work with a lot of South Africans here in Saudi Arabia. And I always think that you South Africans live in a what do we call that? A parallel universe. And the reason,
we do.
Yeah, well, the reason why is because when we drive the car, they say, watch out for the robots. And I keep looking for robots and I don't find any.
That is still part of my culture shock of moving to the U.S., Dennis, because people look at me as if I'm totally crazy because we speak a different language, yes, although we all speak English.
Robot. Wait, I'm looking around for a robot and I almost got hit by a car because I ran a red light. Because I didn't see the robot.
Well, you call the road the pavement and we call the sidewalk the pavement. So you drive on the pavement and we will not allow driving on the pavement. So it's very, very strange.
So everybody, if you're listening, a robot is a traffic light. They call them robots. So I'm not sure why that is, and I'm not even going to get into it because we have more important things. Karin, going back now, you've been doing a little bit of the radio circuit, so welcome to Inside the Eye Live. It's good to have you. You know, we had a guy by the name of J.B. Campbell years ago. And J.B. Campbell, he actually founded the modern militia movement in America, and he served in Rhodesia's Black Corps or something like that, the Black Suits or something like that. You're from Rhodesia, former Rhodesia. You kind of remember those days, don't you?
Yes. Sadly for me, I remember the heyday of Rhodesia, Namibia, and South Africa. So when I get homesick, I have to remind myself that none of that exists anymore. The things that I'm homesick for don't exist. It's very sad because they were incredible countries. Rhodesia and South Africa were the breadbaskets of Africa. We exported food all over the world. We had clean, well-kept, law and order countries. We were in the forefront of research and development in so many areas. It was in their heyday. Those countries were fabulous. And today, if you see them, you want to cry. If it's your country that is bred into your blood and bones, you really want to cry to see what they are today.
Well, what was it like in Rhodesia? I mean, obviously law and order and stuff, but you were obviously a young girl at the time. What was it like living in Rhodesia?
I was very young, but Rhodesia was beautiful. It was an excellent country. The streets, broad streets, tree-lined shopping where people from all over Africa used to come to the upmarket stores in Rhodesia. And the schooling was excellent. The country was just beautiful. It was fabulous. The same as South Africa was. It was just fabulous. First world, what you would expect from a first world country. It was just great. The education was fabulous. Everything was, as far as I could see as a kid, it was wonderful, wonderful place to grow up. The same as in the USA. Well, not so much today, but recently, where kids could ride their bicycles in the street and come home when the street lights went on. It was safe. It was clean. There was money. People had jobs. And then it all fell apart. And it is what it is today. I mean, Zimbabwe, which was Rhodesia, has a $3 trillion note. So that's what money is worth. And on it is printed an expiry date. So your money expires in that country. I mean, you cannot imagine. It's not even third world. It's worse than that. Banana Republic doesn't begin to describe Rhodesia and South Africa today.
And what about Southwest Africa? Namibia.
Namibia. Namibia was a German colony, so there's a huge German influence there. The buildings are built in the German way. When we first went there, there were no supermarkets. They were just mom and pop stores. And if you didn't speak German, you just got nowhere in that country at all. So we, coming from Rhodesia, spoke English and French. And I remember the day my mom went into a store and asked, could she please have some milk and bread? And the guy looked at her and he just said 9. And my mom said, no, she doesn't want 9 milks and bread. She just wants 1. So we learned to speak German fast when we got there, because if you didn't in those days, you just couldn't survive.
And take us back in time. What time was this about?
That was in the 1950, early 60s.
Wow. That's dating you, but that at least puts it in perspective equally, right?
Yeah, it was the early 60s when we went to Southwest Africa. And it was great. The same thing applied there. It was first world. I mean, everything worked. And you can't say that for any country in Africa today. And I do believe that is why the rest of the world is suffering this influx of so-called refugees. They're refugeeing from the chaos and the dirt bowls that they have created in their own countries since they decolonized. They can't run anything. They can't make things work. And so the colonial influence can only keep itself going for so long before it falls apart without maintenance. And that is what has happened hugely in South Africa today. The power stations, for instance, they managed to keep limping along for the first, say, 15 years of black rule, and now they've fallen apart and there is no power supply. Well, there is, but faltering power supply in South Africa. And that is why they're signing an agreement with the Russians for nuclear power stations. Now, can you just imagine the disaster in waiting if they cannot even maintain coal-powered power stations? We are going to have 4 nuclear power stations. It is crazy what is going on in those countries.
I would assume they'd have to have 100% Russian technicians, or else those things are going to pose a danger to everybody on the southern part of Africa.
Well, I do believe they're going to have to, Dennis, because they just cannot run them themselves. I mean, there's no question about that. They can't even run a bath, those people.
Now, for those who aren't familiar with South Africa, a lot of us aren't from South Africa. There's a lot of concern, as you know, about the hashtag on Twitter, white genocide, what's going on, people, displacements in Europe, etc. So it's become a very hot topic. In South Africa, obviously, you had the white community, but from what I understand, reading some of your website, South Africa really was kind of like an unpopulated area of the planet when the first settlers came there. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Absolutely, Dennis. That is one of the biggest lies that the mainstream media has promulgated about South Africa. And that is why there was such an outcry against apartheid, because as far as the world was concerned, white South Africans came into Africa and annihilated hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of blacks that were living there and stole their land. which is totally not true. When the Dutch landed in Cape Town in 1652, there was one very small tribe of Africans resident in Southern Africa at that time. And they are not, you think of Africans as these tall, black, spear and shield wielding, almost Zulu type people. And these were not people like that. They are little people, light in color and big backsides, and small people who were nomadic herders and didn't have towns or anything like that. And these people were called the Khoi that were resident in the Cape at that time. And
talk about Cape in South Africa. Define kilometers inside the Cape. I mean, what geography are you referring to?
All right. So the South Africa is a country of about 135 in Africa on the southernmost tip of Africa. It is bigger than Texas, but not very much bigger. It has a population today of approximately 70 million, of which 3.5 million are white. And Cape Town is the southernmost city in South Africa. It's the Cape. It has many names: the Cape of Good Hope, the Cape of Storms, the warm Benguela current, and the cold current from the west side of Africa meet there. So the hot and cold currents joining together cause immense storms and bad weather there. And every ship that had to go to the east had to round the Cape of Storms, which was very difficult for them. A lot of ships were sunk there. So the Dutch, who had just opened sea routes to the east and were trading for silks and spices, the Dutch East India Company, needed a place where they could refresh their ships on the way east. So they decided to use the Cape as a refreshment center. At that time, in 1652, they did not want to colonize or form a colony or inhabit the South Africa at all. All they wanted was to establish a small refreshment station for the ships. And so Jan van Riebeeck, who was the first governor of the Cape, was sent there by the Dutch East India Company, and he created this refreshment station. But obviously, to do that, you need to have market gardens and farms and things in order to grow the vegetables. So they had indentured servants brought out from Holland, and they were then put to work to grow vegetables to resupply the ships. And they traded with the Khoi to get their cattle, because they owned cattle. So the meat came from trade with the Khoi, and the vegetables and fruits came from the Dutch themselves. But
this situation kind of lasted for quite some time then, did it not? For 100 years or more?
Yes, it was a very long time. It was only in the 1670s, so it was 20 or 30 years later, that the Dutch East India Company committed to establishing a permanent settlement at the Cape, because they were scared that the British were going to lay claim to the British or the French were going to lay claim to the Cape, and that would cut off many people's route around the Cape of Good Hope. So they committed to forming a permanent settlement there, and also the indentured servants were beginning to outlast their indenturedness and were becoming free burghers who wanted their own piece of property. They wanted to grow things for themselves. They wanted to be free men and own land. So they were then given properties to farm on. But they were not happy with the fact that they had to sell everything to the Dutch East India Company at prices set by the Dutch East India Company. And that was the beginning of the Great Trek, which was the march inland to escape the influence and the taxes that they didn't like at all. So it was their first march to freedom of the Boers was in in the 1700s, I think, was the first great trek, and they just loaded up their wagons and loaded up their families and went inland looking for a better life and more freedom. And it was only then, and this was 120 to 150 years after the Dutch landed at the Cape, that they first met the real Black Hordes, who did not live in South Africa. They were coming from up north, and they swept everything before them. Now, they've become the Zulu tribe, but at that time there were no Zulus. They were just disparate tribes formed from...
We're going into a break there. Hold your thought there, Karin. It's The Fetch Inside the Eye Live with Karin Smith right here on Revolution Radio, freedom6.com. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back, everybody. It's The Fetch Inside the Eye Live, intelligent media for the politically aware. And again, it is Saturday, October the 24th, 1 week before Halloween, everybody. That should be fun. I wish I was there to enjoy it. We do have a little bit of Halloween in America. Maybe we'll have one at the U.S. Embassy and some of the embassies here in the district, but I'm just too far away from Saudi, Riyadh, that is, to enjoy it. So it's definitely here in Saudi Arabia, the Western holidays, you miss them entirely. So that's just the way it goes. It's now 6:34 in the evening. Joining me from Texas, Karin Smith. She is a activist, really working in the white genocide issue in South Africa. Her father passed just a year or so, 2-3 years ago, based on what's going on. And I've had a lot of friends from South Africa over the years, folks, so I'm kind of aware what's going on. I call South Africa, Karin. I'm from L.A. I call South Africa South Los Angeles on steroids.
I don't know. I've never been to LA, but yeah, South Africa is not a good place to be.
It's
for white people anyway.
Yeah,
but not even for black right now.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just not
good for anybody. It's the only people. Well, let's just move along real quick because we want to get the history in and just get up to speed because I know you've got some things that you'd like to talk to people about that's going on now. But, you know, I think 120 years or so after this, you had a British invasion, didn't you, back in the early 1900s? The British eventually, they kind of decided to really take that place, and they invaded that place, didn't they?
Yes, they did. By that time, gold and diamonds had been found. So the Boers had two Boer republics. They had the South African Republic, which was in the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. They had two little areas that were their own. They spoke Afrikaans. They had their own churches, the Dutch Reformed Church. They ruled themselves, basically. And they were living quite peacefully. But then gold and diamonds were found, and the British did not like this. They did not want these little republics to have more money than them. So essentially they invaded. The First Boer War was very short, and the British won. Now the Second Boer War is what from 1899 to 1902 is the war that I would like to speak to you about because it's relevant to what is happening in South Africa today. The British, the way they went to war was quite strange, and they hadn't learned different by living in Africa. So they still went to war in their red jackets and with a little drummer boy in the front beating the march, etc. And they did not understand that the Boers were not employed by the state. They were just called up and they went to war. Then they had to take with them their own horse, their own rifle, and 8 days rations in their saddlebag. That's what they had to take. They were not paid by anybody. They were not an army as such. They were just people, as your militias are today, protecting their homes and families. So off these people went to war, and they were vastly outnumbered by the British because the British in the Second Boer War were bringing in shiploads of people from Britain because they took this war quite seriously, not like the first one. And when they realized that the Boers were fighting a kind of a guerrilla war because they'd rush out from behind mountains and the bush and attack the supply train or attack a certain area of the British army and then disappear again, the British realized that they were thin spread because their supply trains had to come all the way from Natal to where they were fighting, and that the Boers had no supply train really because every farm in South Africa was a supply place for them, because they could go to any farm and get supplies, sleep the night, and leave the next day. So what the British did was they instituted a scorched earth policy. So they burnt the farms, they salted the wells, they poisoned the water supply, they killed the cattle, and took the women, children, and older men off to concentration camps. As far as I know, these were the first incidents of concentration camps in the world. I don't know if there were any before that. Now, these concentration camps were terrible, terrible places. They were ill-nourished. There was no control over them, and nobody cared about these people. They were worried about killing off the Boers, because I just read a piece this morning that said Lord Kitchener initiated plans to flush out guerrillas in a series of systematic drives, organized like a sporting shoot, with success defined in a weekly bag of killed, captured, and wounded, and to sweep the country bare of everything that could give sustenance to the guerrillas, including women and children. It was the clearance of civilians, uprooting a whole nation, that would come to dominate the last phase of the war. And that is the truth, because they put thousands. There were black camps as well, because a lot of the blacks were fighting.
In fact, Karin, there were 45 tenant camps for Boers, 64 for black Africans.
Yes.
Something like 28,000 men were captured, of which 25,630 so were sent back overseas. So that was a huge thing, with 26,000 women actually perishing in these camps. So it was a terrible, terrible situation.
That's over 50,000 Boers disappeared from the African continent at that time. And there were never very many of them.
Just real quick, what's the difference between the Boers and the Afrikaners in the languages?
Okay, there is still a huge fight going on in South Africa today about who is a Boer and who is an Afrikaner. Afrikaans developed from Dutch and Flemish and was kind of a bastardized version of those languages in order to create a way that they could communicate with the locals. And it is one of only three languages accepted as a modern language in the world today, a new language. It is spoken only in South Africa. There's a small group of people in Argentina who speak Afrikaans as well, but I believe that is dying out. Now, the argument about who is a Boer and who is an Afrikaner is kind of who is Amish. If you can trace your line back to Jan van Riebeeck, and you have never intermarried with English people, and you are an original settler, then you are a Boer. If you are other than that, then you are an Afrikaner, as I understand it. There's a huge argument, as I say, even to today, about who is who. A Boer is a farmer. It means farmer in Afrikaans, and an Afrikaner, an Afrikaans-speaking person. So who is a Boer and who is an Afrikaner is a very difficult question to answer, because even they can't answer that.
And when we fast forward now, we get the nation of South Africa, it's formed. You get into this idea that essentially the white population is tired of all the attacks by the hordes, as you had called them earlier, I think,
Yes.
At some point, the whites are saying, look, this isn't working for you. It's not working for us. We need to just live in separate enclaves. And that really was kind of what was behind apartheid, wasn't it? Not suppression or oppression, but just realizing we cannot work together, so let's just live separately. And we whites will help you pay for it.
Absolutely, because forced integration doesn't work. You're seeing that around the world today. You cannot force integration with people who are totally different from yourself. They do not have the same ethics, the same religion, the same language. They don't want to integrate with you, but you must integrate with them. So the Boers were always outnumbered by the blacks, and they've eventually formed the Union of South Africa, and they saw that there were too few of them to do the mining, the work that is required to create a first world country. So what they did was they gave each tribe of blacks their own homeland. So the Zulus had Zululand, and the Vendas had Venda, and the Swazis had Swaziland, and so on. But those homelands were built up and looked after by the white taxpayers. They gave them roads, hospitals, schools, universities, everything that a modern country would need. They built in these homelands for the blacks and maintained it all by the white taxpayer base. But the blacks did not like the fact that they had to have a passport, which they called a dompas, to come into the white area and work and prove that they had a reason to be there. So that was the root cause of the black uprising, and also the fact that they were taught in Afrikaans in Soweto, and so the school children, which is a parallel of what's happening exactly this week in South Africa, they rose up and rioted and burnt and looted because they did not want to be taught in Afrikaans. They wanted to be taught in their own languages. But in their own languages, there are no words for modern things. There's no words for technology and PCs and nothing. And there were no books. They didn't have a written language. So
it's like, okay, if you want to be taught in your own language, then go do it. Don't talk to
exactly.
Do
go write your books and get yourself professors, etc. But we didn't do that to them. We did try and teach them in English and or Afrikaans. So as is happening this week in South Africa, there was an uprising that was supposedly because of being taught in Afrikaans, but I don't believe that's what it was, because they put the children in front of the marchers, and because we were fighting a civil war in our own country and we were fighting the communists on our borders, we had a very heavy police and army presence, and they called out the army to stop the Soweto riots, and there came that iconic picture of the black guy the little black teenager being shot, and that is what the world saw then and thinks today of white South Africans. But they did the same thing this week. They bust in school children and put them in front of the university riots. So the black police fired on them, and there's another iconic picture of a little kid, a school kid, who has been rubber bulleted by the police. So it's a tactic that they used then, and they're using it exactly that today. But what I would like to talk about is the concentration camps. So in the concentration camps during the Boer War, at least 20%, if not more, of the white population was annihilated. They died of starvation, typhus, cholera, etc., etc. And then they were sent home in 1902 to what? Their farms were burnt down, their water was poisoned, their land was salted. They had nothing to go back to. So it took them generations to rebuild. They'll never rebuild the population that was broken, but to rebuild the country into what it was prior to 1994. Now, today, exactly that same thing is happening in South Africa. The ANC took over and they instituted affirmative action laws, which were not so bad, because one can understand that the previously disadvantaged must have a leg up to help them reach the level of first world. But what became of that is we're all going down to the lowest common denominator and becoming beggars. So over those 21 years, they have now instituted more than 120 race-based laws that exclude white people from the job market, exclude them from education, exclude them from any social grants and help. And so today, 20 to 25% of the white population in South Africa have been disenfranchised, have no homes, have no jobs, will never get a job, and their children cannot be educated. So what the whites did when they discovered this problem was just getting bigger by the day, some kind white people made land available for these homeless people to build homes on and just have some security in numbers. Because I'm sure you know about the number of white people that are being tortured, raped, burnt.
Yeah, I saw
Their deaths are horrific.
Yeah, I saw a video of one of the leading Afrikaners who was killed, I guess, a year or so ago. I don't know his name, but he was a leading Afrikaner, and I guess they have I guess there's like something like 7 or 8 different provinces in South Africa, something like that.
Yes.
And they have all the farmers killed. It's now I'm not hearing the 60,000. They put over 3,600 farmers on these memorials. And they're saying very clearly, look, at this rate, within 20 years, no one will farm. And it's getting harder and harder to farm now.
Well, the most dangerous job in the world is to be a white farmer in South Africa. You have more chance of being murdered, tortured and murdered, because they don't just come and kill you. But the other problem with that is they're taking their farms away from them with this Land Redistribution Act. So if somebody they just have to come and say, my ancestors grazed goats on your property 500 years ago. And with almost certainty, that farm will then be handed over to that black person and the farmer has to go. And so from 120,000 farms, we are now down to 30,000. And there have been over 4,000 farmers murdered, never mind the dispossessed ones. But over 85,000 white people have been tortured and murdered in the last 21 years.
80,000 whites, but only 3,600 farmers.
Yes. This is in a country little bigger than Texas. It is shocking. It is horrifying. And the mainstream media, or nobody is talking about it whatsoever. So there are now these white squatter camps in South Africa in which over 1 million whites are living. And of those, more than 350,000 are children.
Now, Karin, I'm hearing that these camps aren't just whites, though. You have a lot of people from Malawi, from Botswana, Zimbabwe. You have a lot of black people in these camps, too, I'm being told. Is that true?
You have there have always been black squatter camps in South Africa, always. Because the blacks have flowed in from the north, trying to find work and get their slice of civilization. And they just literally squatted on land that did not belong to them. Now, that is why I don't like the way that we call them white squatter camps, because the whites are not just squatting on land that does not belong to them. It has either been rented to or given to them for the purpose of forming communities where they have a safety in numbers thing. Because imagine in South Africa today with your family of 4 kids living in a car somewhere in the bush. I mean, it's just too dangerous. So the whites consider themselves very lucky if they can find a spot in one of the squatter camps. So yes, there are a whole bunch of black squatter camps, and the number of them have increased rather than decreased under ANC rule. And I'm not saying that life is any easier for them. But what I am saying is that they do not have laws, race-based laws, excluding them from the job market. They can get social grants and grants per child, etc., from the government, which the whites cannot get. So you have these whites in these camps. Now, in South Africa, you have to pay school fees, you have to wear a uniform, you have to pay for your books, and you have to get yourself to and from school. There aren't school buses like here in the States, which pick you up and take you to school. So you can imagine if your parents are living in a construct of cardboard boxes and don't know where the next meal is coming from, they obviously cannot afford any of these ways of educating their children. So these children are malnourished and totally not being educated at all. Not that the education system in South Africa is anything to be proud of, but they're not going to school. So what are we raising as the next generation of white South Africans?
You have something called the South African Family Relief Project. This is something that you wanted to raise. Tell us a little bit about the South African Family Relief Project.
Well, because of the burgeoning number of whites who don't have jobs and don't have a meal, a whole lot of white South Africans got together on a volunteer basis and started raising money to put floors and decent housing up for these people, and also to send the kids to school, to get medical care for them, to get doctors, etc. for them, and to take them food and clothing. Now, South African Family Relief Project is my favorite charity because I know the people concerned, and I know that none of the money sent to them goes into their own pockets. They do not get salaries. They pay everything out of their own pockets. So they delivered 8 tons of food this week, and they did it on their own dime. They didn't take it out of donations. But because the same white companies in South Africa that are not allowed to employ white people, they are not allowed to donate to any charity that is not 70% black. And they're not allowed to donate to orphanages that are not 70% black. I
never hadn't heard that one. That kind of floors me a bit.
Yes, they withdrew all funding from an orphanage because it was too white. So they withdrew the funding, and those kids don't have food or clothes or any means of support because the government withdrew the funding for it.
Okay, now the long-term trend here, Karin, is what you're saying is that the laws in place is really about genociding the white people out of South Africa.
Yes, it is.
That's what the policies are really designed to do.
Absolutely. Dr. Gregory Stanton from Genocide Watch, which is an international organization based in America who watch countries at risk for genocide, has put the white South Africans on level 6 of 8 levels of genocide, 7 being it in full swing and 8 being when the government died.
Out of time. You'll have to come back. It's a great story. You'll come back, huh?
I will. Thank you very much.
Karin, have a great afternoon. Enjoy. Stay wet. Stay dry, I should say. It's The Fetch, everybody. Thanks, Karin. We'll be back with more after this, everybody.